Imagine controlling the finances of your enemies, lending to governments you're not allowed to vote in, funding wars on both sides, not out of cruelty, but because both sides needed you and you needed no one. At the height of their power in the 1850s, the Rothschild family held wealth equivalent to roughly $2 trillion today, more than most of the nations writing to them for loans. They were not royalty. They were not welcome in most of European society. By law, they couldn't own land, practice most trades, or even walk through certain city gates on Christian holidays. And yet, Europe couldn't function without them. How? That's exactly what this documentary is about. The street had no sunlight worth speaking of. Barely 4 meters wide at its narrowest point, the Judengasse, or Jews' Lane, of Frankfurt stretched northward like a crooked scar through the old city, its upper stories leaning inward until the sky above was little more than a pale ribbon. By the mid-1700s, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people were pressed into this single lane, behind walls that Frankfurt's Christian authorities had constructed and maintained for over 2 centuries. This was not poverty by accident. It was poverty by law. The Frankfurt Judengasse operated under a suffocating legal architecture. Jewish families could not own land outside the ghetto walls. They could not practice most trades. They were forbidden from farming, from joining guilds, from holding civic office. The city gates closed to them on Sundays and Christian holidays. They could not walk freely through certain streets. And crucially, the total number of Jewish marriages permitted each year was strictly limited, a deliberate attempt to control the population's growth and, by extension, its influence. What the law denied them in land and craft, it inadvertently concentrated elsewhere. Trade, moneylending, the circulation of coins. These were the channels left open, and Jewish families moved through them with the focused energy of people who had no other choice. Into this world in 1744, a boy named Mayer Amschel Bauer was born. His father, Moses Amschel Bauer, ran a small currency exchange and trading business from the family home, a house marked with a red shield, a Rothschild in German. It was a common enough name among Frankfurt's Jewish families, but it would not remain obscure for long. From his earliest years, Mayer Amschel absorbed the rhythms of his father's trade. He learned to distinguish coins from dozens of principalities, to read their weight and their wear, to understand that the value printed on a coin and the value a market assigned to it were often 2 different things entirely. This was not merely a lesson in commerce. It was a lesson in navigating a world that operated by hidden rules. When both his parents died of smallpox in 1755, the 11-year-old boy was sent north to Hanover, where family connections secured him an apprenticeship with the banking firm of Oppenheimer. There, in one of the most respected Jewish financial houses in the German states, Mayer Amschel encountered something transformative. He saw what patient, disciplined financial relationships with powerful patrons could produce. He returned to Frankfurt in 1763, carrying that knowledge like a coin in his pocket, worn smooth from handling but never spent. The ghetto walls still stood. The restrictions had not changed. But Mayer Amschel Rothschild had begun to understand something that the walls could not contain, that money, moved carefully, could travel anywhere. He returned to the Judengasse with little more than his training and his instincts. But Mayer Amschel Rothschild had identified his opening, and it was smaller and stranger than anyone might have predicted. Rare coins. In the 1760s, the collecting of ancient and unusual currency was a fashionable pursuit among European aristocracy. Princes and noblemen competed to assemble cabinets of curiosities, and a well-sourced coin dealer could earn not just money but something far more valuable in that world: access. Mayer Amschel understood this completely. He began assembling a modest inventory of rare and antique coins, metals, and antiquities, offering them at prices deliberately kept attractive to wealthy buyers. Every transaction was an introduction. Every introduction was a door held slightly ajar. The door he needed to open belonged to William, Crown Prince of Hesse-Kassel. The House of Hesse-Kassel occupied a peculiar position in European finance. The principality had become extraordinarily wealthy through a practice that strikes modern observers as startling in its directness: renting its own soldiers to foreign powers. Hessian troops had fought across Europe and beyond under this arrangement, and the revenues flowed upward to the ruling family. William, heir to this fortune, was already among the richest men on the continent, and he was known to be interested in rare coins. Mayer Amschel pursued the connection with patience and precision. Through existing contacts, he secured introductions, offering William curated selections from his inventory at notably favorable terms. By 1769, the relationship had solidified enough that William granted him a formal designation. Mayer Amschel Rothschild became a Hofjude, a court factor, to the House of Hesse-Kassel. The title sounds modest. It was anything but. For a Jewish merchant in Frankfurt, the designation of court factor was a form of partial liberation from the legal machinery that pressed down on ghetto life. It provided protection, a degree of freedom of movement, and crucially, a stamp of legitimacy that eased dealings with other powerful clients. It announced, to anyone paying attention, that this coin dealer from the Judengasse had earned the confidence of serious money. Other aristocratic clients began to follow. While Mayer Amschel was constructing these external relationships, he was simultaneously building something equally durable at home. In 1770, he married Guttel Schnapper, the daughter of a respected Frankfurt merchant. She was 17. He was 26. The match was considered a good one by Judengasse standards, and it would prove foundational to everything that followed. Together, Mayer Amschel and Guttel would have 10 children who survived to adulthood, 5 sons and 5 daughters. The family lived and worked inside the same cramped house on the Judengasse, the business conducted on the ground floor, the family pressing into the rooms above. In this environment, the children did not simply observe the trade. They were apprenticed into it almost from birth, absorbing the logic of exchange, the importance of reputation, and the discipline of patient accumulation. Mayer Amschel had no illusions about the world his children were entering. The ghetto walls remained. The legal restrictions remained. But he had proven that a relationship cultivated carefully enough, with the right patron, could begin to bend those restrictions. He had transformed a coin business into a political connection, and a political connection into a platform. The House of Hesse-Kassel held vast sums that needed to be managed, invested, and moved across borders. Mayer Amschel had positioned himself close to that fortune, close enough to be useful. And in the world he was building toward, usefulness was the key that opened every other door. By the 1780s, Mayer Amschel Rothschild was no longer simply selling coins. The relationship with William of Hesse-Kassel had matured into something considerably more complex and considerably more lucrative. William had by now inherited the full weight of his family's fortune, becoming Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel and one of the wealthiest sovereigns in Europe. Managing that wealth required more than a coin dealer. It required a financial operator. The source of William's fortune deserves a moment of clear examination. The Landgraviate of Hesse-Kassel had perfected the business of supplying mercenary soldiers to foreign powers at commercial rates. Tens of thousands of Hessian troops had been contracted out across the continent and across the Atlantic, most famously to the British Crown during the American Revolutionary War. Roughly 17,000 Hessian soldiers served in North America during that conflict. The fees and subsidies that flowed back to William were enormous. He was not spending this money lavishly. He was accumulating it, lending it, investing it, and looking for capable agents to extend his reach. Mayer Amschel recognized the opportunity with characteristic precision. He began positioning himself not merely as a supplier of curiosities, but as a handler of financial instruments. Bills of exchange, the credit instruments that allowed merchants and sovereigns to move money across borders without physically transporting gold or silver, were the circulatory system of European commerce. Learning to discount and trade these bills meant entering a different world entirely, the world of professional finance. This transition was not simple. Frankfurt already had established Jewish banking families operating at this level. The Bethmans and the Oppenheimers had been handling sovereign accounts and international transactions for decades, with connections and reputations that Mayer Amschel could not match. Breaking into their domain required something these families occasionally lacked: an exceptionally well-positioned patron willing to direct business toward a trusted agent. William provided exactly that. As the volume of transactions routed through Mayer Amschel grew, so did his practical education in sovereign finance. He learned how states borrowed money, how interest was structured across long repayment periods, how different currencies interacted, and crucially, how a skilled intermediary could profit at each stage of the process. Every bill he discounted for William's account was a lesson in the mechanics of power expressed through paper. What distinguished Mayer Amschel in this competitive environment was a combination of absolute discretion and meticulous record-keeping. William valued privacy. His financial arrangements were sensitive by nature, touching on diplomatic relationships, military contracts, and personal accumulation that he preferred to conduct quietly. A banker who leaked nothing, who kept precise accounts, and who performed reliably was worth far more than a competitor offering marginally better terms. By the close of the 1790s, Mayer Amschel had moved from the margins of William's financial world toward its center. His firm was handling loans, managing portions of the Hessian fortune, and operating as a genuine participant in the sovereign debt markets that connected European princes to international capital. The 5 sons he had been training inside the Judengasse house were absorbing every dimension of this expanding operation. Europe itself was changing with violent speed. Revolutionary France had overturned the old order across the continent, and the wars that followed were consuming resources on a scale that no previous generation had experienced. States needed money. Enormous quantities of it moved quickly and reliably across borders that were increasingly militarized. The man who had spent 20 years learning how that money moved was about to discover what happened when the demand for it became nearly infinite. What does a father do when the world he has built cannot contain his ambitions for his children? Mayer Amschel Rothschild answered that question with a plan of breathtaking audacity. He would not keep his sons in Frankfurt. He would scatter them across the continent deliberately, strategically, like seeds planted in the most fertile soil available. Each son would establish a house in a different financial capital. Each house would operate independently enough to gain local trust, yet remain bound to the others by ties of blood, shared method, and constant communication. Together, they would form something Europe had never encountered, a private banking network that transcended national borders entirely. The eldest, Amschel, stayed in Frankfurt to anchor the original house and manage the ongoing relationship with William of Hesse-Kassel. Salomon would eventually move to Vienna, the seat of Habsburg imperial power. Karl would establish himself in Naples, gateway to the Mediterranean economies. James, the youngest, would make his way to Paris, the restless capital of a continent in revolution. And Nathan, the third son, and perhaps the most gifted of all five, left Frankfurt first. In 1798, Nathan Rothschild arrived in Manchester. He was 21 years old, carried a modest sum of capital, and spoke limited English. What he possessed instead was an education in financial instruments that most English merchants had never received, combined with a ferocious instinct for commercial opportunity. Manchester in the late 1790s was transforming itself into the engine room of industrial production. Textile manufacturing was scaling at extraordinary speed, and the trade networks connecting British cloth to continental markets were chaotic, expensive, and riddled with inefficiency. Nathan saw the gap immediately. He began trading textiles, purchasing goods directly from manufacturers and cutting out the layers of middlemen who consumed margin at every step. Within a few years, he had moved from Manchester to London, positioning himself at the center of British financial life rather than its industrial periphery. The textile trade had been his entry point. Banking would be his destination. Meanwhile, the system binding all five brothers together was already taking shape. The Rothschild correspondence network was unlike anything operated by rival banking families. Letters traveled through private couriers rather than public post, moving faster and more securely than government dispatches in some cases. The family developed coded language for sensitive commercial information, disguising prices, quantities, and counterparties behind agreed-upon terms that meant nothing to anyone intercepting the communication. In an era when information about crop failures, military movements, or currency fluctuations could be worth fortunes, controlling that information and controlling it privately was itself a form of capital. The strategic logic of the entire arrangement became clearer with each passing year of war. No single government could freeze the Rothschild network. No single financial catastrophe could destroy it. If one market collapsed, capital and information flowed through the others. The family moved money across borders that armies could not cross, because their trust in one another substituted for the institutional guarantees that formal banks required. On September 19, 1812, Mayer Amschel Rothschild died in Frankfurt at the age of 68. He had spent half a century building the foundation beneath his sons. His testament was characteristically precise. Control of the family's finances was reserved for male heirs. No outsider could audit the books. The five houses were to operate in permanent coordination, sharing intelligence and supporting one another in times of difficulty. Daughters and their husbands were excluded from the partnership structure, a provision that ensured the integrated network remained under unified family discipline. He had not lived to see the full harvest of what he planted. But the architecture was complete. 5 houses, 5 cities, one family bound by written covenant and shared interest. The timing was almost uncanny. The wars consuming Europe had not yet reached their most devastating or their most expensive phase. Governments were about to discover that moving armies across a continent required something more reliable than hope. They would need bankers with reach, discretion, and the ability to deliver. The 5 sons of Mayer Amschel Rothschild were ready. Before the Rothschilds could become the bankers of Europe, Europe itself had to be broken apart and remade. That process began in Paris in the summer of 1789, and its tremors would reshape everything, including the small Jewish quarter of Frankfurt where Mayer Amschel had spent his entire life. The French Revolution announced itself to Jewish communities across the continent with a complicated mixture of hope and terror. On one hand, revolutionary ideals of universal liberty carried the promise of emancipation, of civil rights finally extended to populations that had been confined, taxed, and humiliated for centuries. On the other hand, revolution meant instability, and instability had historically expressed itself against Jewish communities with predictable and terrible violence. For the established banking houses of Europe, the revolution was an immediate catastrophe. The great private fortunes tied to the French crown and the aristocratic order simply evaporated. Credit networks built over generations collapsed overnight. The old certainties of European finance, the assumption that sovereign debts would be honored, that borders would remain fixed, that currencies would hold their value, were revealed as fragile fictions. Into this chaos stepped Napoleon Bonaparte. His campaigns beginning in the 1790s and accelerating after he seized power in 1799 redrew the map of Europe with terrifying speed. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries were abolished in weeks. New states were created, governed by Napoleon's relatives loyal to Paris. Each conquest brought new currencies, new customs arrangements, new rules governing who could trade where and under what conditions. For a family with financial connections stretching across multiple countries, this volatility was not simply risk. It was also, for those positioned correctly, extraordinary opportunity. Trade routes disrupted in one direction could be exploited from another. Currency dislocations created arbitrage possibilities invisible to those watching from only one vantage point. The crisis that would prove most consequential for the Rothschilds came in 1806. Napoleon's armies swept into the German states, dissolving the Holy Roman Empire and forcing local rulers to flee or submit. Among those who fled was William IX of Hesse-Kassel, Mayer Amschel's most important client for decades. William departed in considerable haste, leaving behind a substantial fortune that required trustworthy custodians. Here the history becomes genuinely contested. Later accounts, some friendly to the Rothschilds and some hostile, describe Mayer Amschel receiving a vast sum from William for safekeeping, then using those funds to build the family's fortune while William remained in exile. The romantic version of the story casts Mayer Amschel as both faithful servant and cunning entrepreneur, simultaneously protecting his patron's money and deploying it brilliantly. The documented reality is more modest and more interesting. Mayer Amschel did receive funds and securities from William's estate, and he did manage them during the period of French occupation. The relationship was real. But the idea that the entire Rothschild fortune grew from secretly deployed Hessian gold is unsupported by the account books that survive. The family's rise drew on decades of accumulated client relationships, on the communication network already being built across 5 cities, and on financial skills that no single depositor's fortune could explain. What the episode with William of Hesse-Kassel does reveal is something more durable than legend. Mayer Amschel had spent 30 years building the kind of trust that men turned to when everything else was uncertain. In a continent where institutions were crumbling and governments were fleeing, that trust was perhaps the most valuable asset of all. Napoleon's shadow had fallen across Europe. The wars were still building toward their catastrophic peak. And the Rothschild sons, now stationed across the continent, were about to demonstrate precisely what their father's grand design had been built to accomplish. While his father Mayer Amschel managed the chaos of Napoleonic Germany from Frankfurt, it was Nathan Mayer Rothschild who was quietly engineering something remarkable 400 miles away in London. Around 1809, Nathan made a decision that would define the family's future. He left the textile trade in Manchester, where he had spent nearly a decade learning British commerce from the ground up, and moved south to the heart of British financial power. He settled near St. Swithin's Lane in the city of London, that ancient square mile where merchant banks, insurance houses, and trading firms had clustered for generations. The streets smelled of coal smoke and river damp. The coffee houses buzzed with price intelligence from Amsterdam, Lisbon, and beyond. Nathan absorbed it all with characteristic intensity. He was not, by most accounts, an easy man to know. Contemporary descriptions paint a figure of restless, sometimes intimidating energy. He spoke bluntly, moved quickly, and had little patience for the elaborate social courtesies that smoothed most financial relationships. Where his father had cultivated clients through decades of careful deference, Nathan preferred to make himself indispensable through sheer competence. The results were hard to argue with. His entry point into London high finance was the gold bullion trade, and the timing could not have been more fortuitous. Britain was at war, and war consumed gold. The government needed bullion to pay its armies, to subsidize allied governments across Europe, and to keep the monetary system functioning under extraordinary strain. Gold had become simultaneously scarce and absolutely essential. Nathan recognized the opportunity immediately. Working through the family's network of agents and correspondents across the continent, he developed an extraordinary ability to source gold from wherever it was available and move it to wherever it was needed. This was not simply a matter of buying cheap and selling dear. It required navigating currency restrictions, avoiding French interdiction, managing credit across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, and bearing risks that would have paralyzed more cautious operators. His relationship with the Bank of England and the British Treasury grew from precisely this capability. Officials responsible for financing the war against Napoleon needed someone who could actually deliver gold reliably, in quantity, across a continent that Napoleon's armies were actively disrupting. Nathan could do this when others could not. That practical usefulness opened doors that no amount of social connection would have unlocked for a German-born Jewish merchant in the early 19th century. By 1811 and 1812, Nathan was managing bullion transactions of a scale that drew the attention of treasury officials at the highest levels. He was not yet the dominant figure he would become, but the pattern was established. He was solving problems that no one else could solve, and the British government was beginning to understand that this young man on St. Swithin's Lane was not simply a useful contractor. He was becoming genuinely irreplaceable. What Nathan built in these years was not just a profitable business. It was a reputation for executing the impossible. Other bankers might offer lower rates or more refined company. Nathan offered something rarer: certainty. When he committed to a transaction, it was completed. When he said gold would arrive, it arrived. That reputation, accumulated through years of grueling risk and flawless execution, was the foundation upon which everything that followed would be constructed. The partnerships with governments, the legendary bond issues, the financial architecture of the post-Napoleonic settlement, all of it traced back to these early London years when Nathan Mayer Rothschild proved, transaction by transaction, that he was the man to call when the stakes were highest. The wars were approaching their climax, and Nathan was about to be handed an opportunity that would test every skill he had developed and write his name permanently into financial history. By 1811, the Duke of Wellington's army in the Iberian Peninsula was fighting on empty pockets. The campaign against Napoleon's forces in Spain and Portugal was grinding forward, fortress by fortress, river crossing by river crossing, but the soldiers needed paying, the horses needed feeding, and the Portuguese and Spanish allies demanded subsidies that London struggled to deliver. The problem was not simply one of resources. Britain had gold. The problem was geography. Napoleon's continental system had transformed Europe into a kind of fortified cage. French agents monitored ports, customs officials answered to Paris, and any large movement of specie across the continent risked interception, seizure, and the kind of diplomatic catastrophe that could complicate an already fragile alliance structure. How do you move millions of pounds in gold bullion through a continent controlled by your enemy? The British Treasury, at its wits' end, turned to the one man who had already demonstrated he could navigate the impossible. Nathan's contract to manage Wellington's financial supply line was the largest and most dangerous operation the family had ever attempted. The sums involved were staggering, eventually totaling somewhere near 800,000 pounds in gold coin and bullion, an enormous figure for the period. But the logistics were what truly tested Nathan's network. The operation worked in layers. In London, Nathan purchased gold, much of it East India Company coin, through agents operating quietly so as not to drive up prices. The bullion was then moved to the Channel Coast, often through networks of smugglers who had spent decades perfecting the art of crossing between England and France regardless of what governments on either side had to say about it. War, it turned out, had never entirely stopped the informal commerce of the Channel. Here the story takes a remarkable turn. Rather than routing the gold around France entirely, which would have required dangerous sea voyages and uncertain timelines, Nathan moved significant quantities directly through France itself. This was audacious to the point of appearing reckless. Napoleon's empire was the very adversary being funded against. Yet it worked, in part because of one crucial player: Nathan's younger brother James. James Rothschild was 20 years old and operating in Paris under circumstances that required extraordinary nerve. Officially, he was simply a young merchant conducting legitimate commerce. In practice, he was the central node through which funds were converted, forwarded, and disguised as they passed through the French financial system. Operating under Napoleon's nose, utilizing the family's relationships with French bankers and currency dealers, James ensured that the gold arriving from England could be converted into the forms most useful to Wellington's paymasters in Spain. The French authorities were not entirely oblivious. There were moments of dangerous scrutiny, shipments that had to be rerouted, agents who suddenly became unavailable. The operation demanded constant improvisation. Yet the fundamental insight driving it was sound. Napoleon's own officials and merchants had interests that transcended political loyalty. Money, properly handled, could find its way through almost any barrier. By 1813, Wellington's armies were pushing into France itself, their supply lines functioning with a reliability that their Spanish counterparts could only envy. The gold had arrived. The soldiers had been paid. The alliance had held. The consequences for the Rothschild family were profound. British government officials who had watched the operation succeed month after month against every conceivable obstacle drew an obvious conclusion. Here was a banking house that could be trusted with the most sensitive and complex financial operations the state could devise. Nathan was no longer simply a useful contractor in the bullion trade. He had become something closer to a strategic asset. The war against Napoleon was entering its final phase. Within 2 years, the emperor would be broken at Waterloo and exiled to St. Helena. But even as the cannons fell silent, the financial needs of governments did not. Armies still needed paying. Debts needed servicing. Shattered economies needed reconstruction. The Rothschilds had financed a war. Now they would help build the peace on terms very much of their own making. June of 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte escaped from Elba and, burning with restored ambition, had thrown all of Europe into crisis once again. The 100 days, that desperate final convulsion of French imperial power, sent governments scrambling, armies mobilizing, and bond markets plummeting into panic. In London, Nathan Rothschild watched the price of British government bonds collapse as investors fled uncertainty. The question hanging over every financier, every general, every diplomat was devastatingly simple. Would the coalition hold, or would Napoleon remake the continent a second time? The Rothschild courier network, already the finest private intelligence operation in Europe, moved into high gear. Riders, ships, and agents fanned across the Channel and into the Low Countries, feeding information back through the family's interconnected offices with a speed no government service could match. When Wellington and Napoleon finally met near a small Belgian village on the 18th of June, the result would take days to reach London through official channels. For the Rothschilds, the wait would be considerably shorter. And here the legend begins. The story, repeated in pamphlets, books, and eventually films across nearly 2 centuries, claims that Nathan received news of Wellington's victory hours or even days before any official dispatch reached London. He then allegedly rushed to the stock exchange and, through clever manipulation, signaled false despair to other traders, driving bond prices down before secretly buying everything in sight, pocketing a fortune when the official news confirmed the Allied victory. It is a compelling story. It is also, at best, a dramatic exaggeration. What the historical record actually shows is more nuanced. Nathan did receive early intelligence from the continent. His courier John Roworth brought news of the battle's outcome before official government dispatches arrived, giving Nathan perhaps several hours of advantage. But the market movements during those days were chaotic and ran in multiple directions. Nathan's own position in British government bonds during the Waterloo crisis was not a simple speculative gamble. He had been accumulating bonds for months, partly from genuine belief in Allied victory, partly as part of his ongoing business as a government financier. His profits from the period were real and substantial, but they emerged from a complex picture of risk, not a single masterstroke of insider manipulation. The gap between what Nathan actually did and what the legend claimed he did widened steadily across the 19th century. By the 1830s and 40s, the Waterloo story had taken on a life entirely disconnected from fact. In its fully formed mythological version, Nathan single-handedly controlled British financial markets through deception, reaping tens of millions through cunning manipulation of honest traders. The story was irresistible precisely because it was so simple. Complex financial operations involving months of preparation, genuine risk, and ordinary market forces became, in the retelling, a Jewish banker's diabolical trick. The anti-Semitic potential of this narrative was not accidental. By the latter half of the 19th century, the Waterloo myth had become a cornerstone of a broader conspiracy theory arguing that Jewish bankers deliberately engineered wars and crises for private profit. The Rothschilds, as the most visible and successful Jewish banking family in the world, became the central villains in this story. A French pamphlet published in 1846 spelled out the logic explicitly. The same logic would echo through anti-Semitic literature for the next 100 years, reaching its most poisonous expression in the propaganda of the 1930s. The bitter irony is that the genuine story of Nathan Rothschild during the Waterloo period is remarkable enough without embellishment. A man who had built a courier network capable of outrunning governments, who had financed Wellington's armies through enemy territory, who navigated markets during the most dangerous military crisis in a generation, that story requires no fabrication to be extraordinary. But myths, once embedded, prove stubbornly resistant to evidence. The legend of Waterloo had cemented something in the public imagination that no correction could entirely dislodge. The Rothschilds had won the war, the story insisted. The question now before Europe's governments was whether they could afford to be without them in the peace that followed. The peace that followed Waterloo was, in many ways, more complicated than the war itself. Beginning in the autumn of 1814 and running through the spring of 1815, the Congress of Vienna had gathered the crowned heads and chief ministers of Europe to redraw a continent that Napoleon had shattered: Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, and a restored Bourbon France all sent representatives. They danced, they negotiated, they drew lines on maps. But behind the elegant ballrooms and diplomatic ceremonies, there was an uncomfortable reality that no amount of candlelight could obscure. 20 years of continuous warfare had left every major European government staggering under debts of staggering proportion. France alone faced an indemnity of 700 million francs imposed by the victorious Allied powers. Austria had borrowed so heavily it struggled to service existing obligations. Prussia needed funds to rebuild. Even Britain, whose navy had never been stronger, carried a national debt that had tripled across the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The new European order required money, and the family best positioned to provide it had spent the previous decade building exactly the infrastructure necessary to do so. The five Rothschild brothers, Nathan in London, James in Paris, Salomon in Vienna, Amschel in Frankfurt, and Karl in Naples, now formed something genuinely unprecedented. A pan-European banking network with brothers embedded in every major capital, capable of moving capital across borders with a speed and reliability that no single national institution could match. Sovereign debt issuance, the business of lending directly to governments and organizing bond sales to investors, became the engine of Rothschild expansion in the years after 1815. The French indemnity payments offer perhaps the most striking illustration of the family's new position. The Rothschilds organized loans on behalf of France to help meet Allied demands, while simultaneously maintaining relationships with the Allied powers receiving those payments. They were, in the bluntest terms, profiting from both sides of the post-war settlement. This was not deception. Every party involved understood the arrangement perfectly. It was simply the natural consequence of being the only institution trusted by all sides simultaneously. Yet the Congress of Vienna mattered to the Rothschild family for reasons beyond pure finance. Nathan, Salomon, and their brothers had not forgotten what they were. They were Jews, still subject to the legal restrictions and civic exclusions that governed Jewish life across most of continental Europe. The revolutionary era had briefly extended rights to Jewish communities in French-controlled territories, but restoration governments across Europe were rolling those protections back. In the German states alone, laws restricting Jewish property ownership, marriage, and professional activity were being reinstated. Salomon Rothschild personally lobbied delegates at Vienna for guarantees of Jewish civil rights, a remarkable act for a man conducting simultaneous negotiations with those same delegates over financial matters. The results were modest and inconsistently enforced. But the effort itself signaled something important about how the family understood its position. Financial power and civil dignity were not separate ambitions. They were, in the Rothschild conception, inseparable. The years following Vienna brought recognition of a different kind. Austria granted Salomon a noble title in 1816. Others followed. By the early 1820s, branches of the family across Europe held aristocratic honors that would have been unimaginable for Jewish bankers a generation earlier. They were not assimilating into European aristocracy exactly. They remained visibly, proudly Jewish. But they had crossed a threshold that few families in history ever approached. The new European order had a financial architecture, and the Rothschilds had helped design it. The question was how long that architecture could hold, as old empires strained, new nations stirred, and the revolutionary spirit that Vienna had tried so hard to bury refused to stay quiet. By the 1820s, something existed in European finance that had never existed before. Not a bank, not a firm, a network stretching from the fog of London to the heat of Naples, bound together not by contract alone, but by blood. The five houses had taken their final shape. Amschel Mayer held Frankfurt, the family's origin point, managing German sovereign accounts and maintaining the ancestral home on the Judengasse as a symbol of where the dynasty had begun. Nathan ruled London, the most dynamic financial market in the world, issuing bonds for governments across the continent. James had transformed Paris into perhaps the most socially brilliant of the five houses, entertaining ministers and aristocrats with equal ease. Salomon worked Vienna, navigating the conservative Habsburg court with patience and discretion. Karl, the youngest, operated in Naples, managing loans to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and serving as a quiet southern anchor to the entire enterprise. Each house operated within its own legal and financial environment. Each brother adapted to local customs, local languages, local politics. And yet they functioned as a single organism. The instrument binding them was the partnership agreement, renewed and renegotiated across the decades, which established shared capital pools and divided profits across all five houses simultaneously. A bond issued in London benefited Vienna. A loan arranged in Paris distributed returns to Frankfurt. No single house could pursue its own interests at the expense of the others. The structure was, by the standards of the age, breathtakingly modern. What made it devastating to rivals, though, was something simpler: information. The Rothschilds maintained a private courier network that operated faster than any government postal service in Europe. Riders, boats, and relays carried financial intelligence, family correspondence, and market data across borders with a consistency that national governments could not match. When news broke in Vienna, Nathan in London might know before the British Foreign Secretary did. When markets moved in Paris, Frankfurt received word within hours rather than days. In an era when the price of a government bond could shift dramatically on a single piece of political news, this speed was worth more than any amount of additional capital. And they had capital in abundance. By the mid-1820s, the combined Rothschild fortune was estimated at somewhere between 135 and 150 million francs. To place that figure in context, it exceeded the capital reserves of the Banque de France. Individual European merchant banks of the era typically operated on resources 20 to 40 times smaller. The Rothschilds were not competing in European finance. They were, in measurable terms, the category unto themselves. The family coat of arms, granted with their Austrian nobility and adopted across the houses, depicted 5 arrows bound together in a single fist. The symbolism was deliberate and entirely accurate. 1 arrow could be snapped. 5, held together, could not. The brothers understood this not as sentiment, but as operational strategy. Division would have destroyed them. Unity made them unbreakable. What does it mean when a private family commands capital surpassing central banks, when their couriers outrun government dispatches, when 5 brothers spanning a continent operate as a single coordinated mind? It means that European states, whatever their ambitions, would need to reckon with this network before they could finance any of them. The architecture was in place. Now would come the test of whether it could withstand the turbulence gathering beneath the surface of the restored European order, as liberal movements, nationalist stirrings, and revolutionary pressures began to push back against everything Vienna had tried to establish. The architecture Nathan Rothschild had built was elegant, but elegance alone does not move governments. What moved governments was a new financial instrument, refined and perfected across the 1820s and into the 1830s, that transformed how sovereign debt worked at its most fundamental level. Before the Rothschilds systematized the process, a government seeking to borrow money faced a fragmented, unreliable marketplace. Loans were negotiated privately, priced inconsistently, and distributed through networks that varied wildly in reach and reliability. The Rothschilds changed every part of this equation. They introduced the underwritten bond issue, in which the family itself guaranteed the full value of a loan up front, absorbing the risk of whether investors would actually purchase the debt. Governments received their money immediately. The Rothschilds took the risk, and with it, the profit. Then came the innovation that made their competitors irrelevant almost overnight. Beginning with their major Austrian loans in the early 1820s, the family began issuing bonds denominated simultaneously in multiple currencies. A single Prussian loan might be purchasable in sterling, in francs, in gulden, or in thalers distributed through all 5 houses at once. An investor in Amsterdam could buy the same instrument as one in London or Frankfurt. This was not merely convenient. It expanded the pool of available capital to an entirely new scale, drawing in investors across national borders who had previously been locked out of markets denominated in foreign currencies. The practical result was staggering. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and a constellation of smaller German and Italian states all came through the Rothschild network across this period. Naples borrowed through Karl. The German states turned to Frankfurt and to Nathan's London house simultaneously. Russia, requiring vast sums to stabilize its finances after the Napoleonic exhaustion, entered into loan arrangements that gave the family direct access to St. Petersburg's fiscal planning. And with that access came something governments had not anticipated when they first welcomed these bankers into their treasuries: leverage. The Rothschilds understood something that their state clients were slow to grasp. A government that has borrowed heavily through a single network depends on that network to borrow again. When James in Paris or Nathan in London expressed discomfort with a particular policy direction, that discomfort arrived with an unspoken implication. New credit might flow less freely. Bond prices might be quietly talked down in the markets the family effectively controlled. The threat rarely needed to be stated explicitly. The architecture made it self-evident. This was most visible in their responses to instability. When revolutionary pressures threatened a borrowing government, the Rothschilds would sometimes withhold new lending until order was restored or guarantees were made. They were not ideological reactionaries in any simple sense. They were creditors, and creditors require predictable conditions for repayment. The effect, however, was that Rothschild credit itself became a political instrument, one that several European foreign ministries quietly factored into their calculations. What the family had become by the mid-1830s was something without a precise name in the institutional vocabulary of the era. They were not a central bank. No government had chartered them, and they answered to no public authority. And yet they performed functions that would later define central banking, stabilizing bond markets, providing emergency liquidity, pricing sovereign risk, coordinating credit across borders. The Banque de France existed. The Bank of England existed, but neither commanded the continental reach that 5 coordinated houses operating as one could deploy in a single afternoon. Europe's governments had, without entirely meaning to, handed the pricing of their own ambitions to a family from a Frankfurt ghetto. How long could that arrangement hold before the tensions within it forced a reckoning? The answer would come sooner than most expected. Power attracts enemies. And by the 1820s, the Rothschilds had accumulated more power than almost anyone in Europe could comfortably explain. For those unwilling to credit Jewish bankers with genuine intelligence, discipline, and strategic vision, an explanation was required. The answer they reached for was ancient, and it was ugly. The Hep riots of 1819 had erupted across the German states the year before Nathan cemented his bond market dominance. Beginning in Würzburg in August of that year, mob violence spread through Frankfurt, Hamburg, and dozens of smaller towns. Jewish homes were attacked, synagogues vandalized, communities terrorized. The name itself, Hep, was a taunt whose precise origins remain disputed, but whose intent was unmistakable. For Jewish communities across Central Europe, the riots were a reminder that legal emancipation, where it existed at all, rested on foundations that resentment could crack overnight. The Rothschilds watched this from positions of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary vulnerability simultaneously. They were rich enough to be targets. They were connected enough to seek protection. But they were still Jewish in a continent that had not resolved what that meant. The attacks that followed in print were, in some ways, more durable than the street violence. Through the 1820s and into the 1830s, pamphlets and satirical cartoons multiplied across France, Britain, and the German states. The imagery was consistent. A grotesque Jewish banker, bloated with stolen wealth, pulling the strings of kings who did not realize they were puppets. The cartoons gave these abstractions a face, and increasingly that face belonged to James in Paris or Nathan in London. The accusations followed two tracks that proved endlessly commentable. The first was war profiteering. The claim, repeated with increasing confidence as the decade advanced, was that the Rothschilds had grown rich from other men's blood, financing conflicts on both sides to profit from every death. The second was dual loyalty. A Jewish banking family, the argument ran, could never truly serve the nation whose bonds they underwrote. Their real allegiance was to each other, to their faith, to some invisible transnational conspiracy that transcended borders and crowns alike. Both accusations contained a poisoned irony. The family's actual transnational structure, 5 brothers and 5 capitals coordinating across national lines, was a business model born of necessity and executed with brilliance. Their critics took that same structure and reframed it as sinister proof of everything they already believed. The family's response was characteristically pragmatic. Philanthropy accelerated. In Frankfurt, in London, in Paris, Rothschild money flowed toward hospitals, schools, and civic institutions. The intention was partly genuine, rooted in Jewish traditions of communal obligation. But it was also strategic. Visible generosity complicated the portrait of the grasping parasite their enemies preferred. Discretion became policy. Family correspondence grew more guarded. Public statements were rare. Where their rivals might have defended themselves loudly, the Rothschilds chose quietness and allowed their results to speak. They also drew their elite networks tighter. Friendships with aristocrats, politicians, and ministers were cultivated with care. The closer a duke or a cabinet minister stood to the family, the harder it became to believe the wilder accusations without implicating someone from one's own class. None of it was enough to stop what was spreading. The conspiracy template built around the Rothschild name in these decades proved tragically portable. Strip out the specific names and it could be applied to Jewish communities anywhere in Europe. It would be applied to them. The caricatures drawn in the 1820s would haunt the next century in ways their authors never imagined and their subjects dreaded. The family had navigated prejudice before. What they could not yet know was how much darker that navigation would eventually become. While Nathan dominated London and James consolidated Paris, it was the quietest of the 5 brothers who attempted perhaps the most delicate balancing act of all. Salomon Rothschild arrived in Vienna in the early 1820s not as a conqueror but as a supplicant, seeking entry into an empire whose bureaucratic walls were among the thickest in Europe. Vienna was the beating heart of Metternich's conservative order, a city of Baroque grandeur and carefully managed repression. Prince Clemens von Metternich, Austria's all-powerful foreign minister and architect of post-Napoleonic stability, was not a man who welcomed change. He was also, Salomon would discover, a man who appreciated financial competence. The relationship that developed between the two was one of the most consequential in Central European history. Metternich needed money. The Habsburg Empire, vast and administratively cumbersome, required constant fiscal management. Salomon provided it quietly and reliably. In return, Metternich offered something no amount of wealth could simply purchase: access, protection, and the implicit endorsement of the most powerful conservative statesmen on the continent. The men met regularly, corresponded frequently, and by the 1830s had forged something resembling genuine mutual respect. Yet for all his proximity to power, Salomon Rothschild lived in Vienna under conditions that would have struck any observer as absurd. Austrian law forbade Jews from owning property in the city. They could not reside permanently without special dispensation. Salomon, financier to an empire, was technically a guest in the hotel he was eventually forced to purchase simply to have a place to sleep because he could not legally own a house. He operated from the Hotel Römischer Kaiser for years, turning a legal humiliation into a peculiar landmark. The banker who held Austria's debts could not hold Austrian property. His greatest achievement arrived on iron rails. The Kaiser Ferdinand Nordbahn, launched in the 1830s, became Austria's first major steam railway, connecting Vienna northward toward the coal-rich territories of Moravia and Galicia. Salomon financed it. The project was not merely profitable. It was transformative, threading industrial arteries through the heart of Central Europe and demonstrating that the Rothschild network could build as well as lend. This was the Vienna House's particular genius. Where London traded bonds and Paris managed sovereign debt, Vienna became the bridge connecting Western capital to Eastern opportunity. Polish magnates, Hungarian landowners, and Bohemian industrialists all found that the road to modern finance ran through Salomon's hotel suite on the Rheingasse. It could not last unchanged. The revolutions of 1848 swept Vienna as they swept everywhere, and Metternich himself fled the city in disguise. Salomon left too, his careful architecture of personal relationships suddenly unstable beneath him. But the railway remained, and the financial infrastructure he had built outlasted the political world that had housed it. The next generation would inherit both the achievements and the question of what came after stability collapsed. If Salomon's Vienna represented patience rewarded through careful diplomacy, his younger brother James in Paris represented something altogether more theatrical. Where Salomon had whispered, James announced himself. By the 1830s, James Mayer de Rothschild had become the undisputed king of French finance. His marriage to his niece Betty, daughter of Salomon himself, was more than a family arrangement. It was a consolidation of Rothschild power, uniting two branches of the dynasty in the drawing rooms of the most fashionable city on earth. Betty proved to be James's equal in nearly every arena, hosting salons that drew composers, painters, and prime ministers to their magnificent mansion on the Rue Lafitte. Frédéric Chopin played in their parlor. Heinrich Heine praised them in print, though not always without irony. The couple became fixtures of Parisian society in a way that no Jewish family had managed before them. James cultivated this position deliberately, understanding that social capital and financial capital were inseparable. His art collection grew into one of the finest private galleries in France. His estates, including the spectacular Château de Ferrières constructed later in the 1850s, announced to the world that the Rothschilds were not merely wealthy. They were permanent. But James's most consequential achievement arrived not in a salon, but along 600 kilometers of track. The Chemin de Fer du Nord, chartered in 1845, was the great railway venture of his career. connecting Paris northward to the Belgian border and onward toward the coalfields and manufacturing centers that were remaking European civilization. It was an undertaking of almost incomprehensible scale for its time. James assembled the financing, negotiated the concessions from the French government, and oversaw a project that employed tens of thousands of workers. The railway was also a declaration of strategic intent. The Rothschilds were not merely lending money to governments fighting old wars. They were building the circulatory system of a new industrial economy. Where bonds had financed armies and kept monarchs solvent, railway shares financed factories, fed cities, and moved the coal that powered everything. The family's transition from war finance to industrial investment was not a sudden conversion. It was a gradual recognition that the greatest fortunes of the coming century would be built on infrastructure rather than conflict. This shift carried its own risks. Railway speculation gripped France and Britain alike during the 1840s, and the inevitable crash of 1847 wiped out smaller investors by the thousands. James weathered it. The Chemin de Fer du Nord survived where lesser ventures collapsed, partly because James had insisted on controlling the project rather than merely financing it from a comfortable distance. His philanthropy expanded alongside his fortune. Jewish communities across France benefited from Rothschild generosity, a pattern consistent with the family's long-standing sense of obligation toward fellow Jews who lacked their extraordinary protection. James understood what his position meant in a country where Jewish emancipation was still recent and fragile. When revolution came again in 1848, as it came for Salomon in Vienna and for nearly every established power in Europe, James survived it. He had built something more durable than a relationship with any single regime. He had built the railroad. The upheavals of '48 would force every branch of the family to reckon with a rapidly changing political landscape. And it was in London, where the family's most formidable figure had already departed the scene, that the next transformation would begin. 1848 arrived like a thunderclap across a continent that had convinced itself the worst storms had already passed. In the space of weeks, regimes that had stood for decades began to crack and splinter. The streets of Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Budapest, and Milan filled with crowds demanding constitutions, reforms, and in some cases the complete dismantling of the old order. For the Rothschilds, who had spent 3 decades weaving their fortunes into the fabric of that old order, the moment of reckoning had come. Paris moved first. When Parisian crowds forced King Louis Philippe from his throne in February of 1848, establishing the Second Republic almost overnight, the shock to European financial markets was immediate and violent. James de Rothschild, who had dined with Louis Philippe and lent money to his government, watched bond prices collapse. The French funds fell catastrophically. James later estimated his losses during the revolutionary crisis at several million francs, a staggering sum even for a man of his means. More than money had been lost. An entire world of assumptions about stability had crumbled in a matter of days. In Vienna, the situation became not merely financial but physical. Salomon Rothschild, who had spent decades constructing a magnificent position at the Habsburg court, suddenly found that his palace on the Rheingasse offered no protection at all. When revolutionary crowds filled the streets of the Austrian capital in March, Salomon made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. He fled. The man who had hosted Metternich and bankrolled the Austrian state abandoned his home and his vaults and escaped to Frankfurt, leaving behind a lifetime of careful, patient cultivation. He never returned to Vienna. At 72 years old, He had become a refugee in the city where he had once been received like a prince. The Frankfurt house, the ancestral home of the entire Rothschild enterprise, faced a different and uglier threat. Anti-Jewish violence swept through parts of Germany during the revolutionary upheaval, feeding on centuries of prejudice that liberal politics had suppressed but never extinguished. Crowds attacked Jewish properties. The Rothschild offices in Frankfurt were not spared entirely from the atmosphere of menace and mob violence that descended on the city. Here was a bitter irony that the family understood perfectly well. The revolution that promised liberty and constitutions for European peoples offered Jewish communities something considerably more ambiguous, a reminder that emancipation remained fragile and conditional. How did the family survive what could have destroyed them? The answer lay in something Nathan Mayer Rothschild had understood 40 years earlier in London, and that his sons and nephews had quietly internalized. The Rothschilds had never truly served any single regime. They had served stability itself. And stability, they now demonstrated, could be found in constitutional monarchies and liberal reforms just as readily as in the absolutist courts of the Metternich era. By 1849, the revolutionary wave was already receding. Habsburg power reasserted itself in Austria, with Prussian and Russian assistance crushing the Hungarian uprising. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte restored order in France with breathtaking speed, positioning himself for the coup that would make him Emperor Napoleon III within 3 years. The old order did not fully return, but enough of it survived that the Rothschilds could work with what remained. James reopened his Paris operations and quietly cultivated the new Bonapartist regime, demonstrating the family's remarkable capacity to adapt without appearing to calculate. Salomon's son Anselm took over the rebuilt Vienna house, eventually recovering much of what had been lost. The Frankfurt house survived its moment of vulnerability and continued operating under Amschel's careful management. The revolutions of 1848 had exposed something important about the Rothschild position. Their power was not merely a function of which rulers sat on which thrones. It was a function of credit, of confidence, of the simple fact that governments of every political stripe eventually needed to borrow money. And when governments needed to borrow money, they needed the Rothschilds. The family emerged from the crisis bruised but fundamentally intact, already looking toward the next chapter of European finance taking shape across the Channel. The belief had become almost an article of faith in European financial circles by the early 1850s. The Rothschilds, with their 5 houses spanning London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples, had grown so essential to the borrowing needs of every major power that war between those powers had become, in a practical sense, unaffordable without Rothschild cooperation. The family had nurtured this belief carefully. It served their interests to be seen not merely as bankers, but as guarantors of peace itself. The Crimean War shattered that belief entirely. When Ottoman weakness and Russian imperial ambition collided in the autumn of 1853, drawing Britain and France into a grinding, catastrophic conflict on the Black Sea Peninsula, the Rothschilds discovered the precise boundary of their influence. They had pressed quietly against that boundary for months, using every instrument of financial diplomacy available to them. Lionel de Rothschild in London worked his connections in the British government. James in Paris counseled caution through intermediaries close to Napoleon III. The message was consistent and urgent. A major European war would be ruinously expensive, financially disruptive, and strategically pointless. Nobody listened. Nationalism, imperial pride, and genuine strategic anxiety proved immune to the gentle pressure of credit markets. By March of 1854, Britain and France had declared war on Russia. Faced with a conflict they had failed to prevent, the Rothschilds did what bankers ultimately must do. They financed it. Lionel de Rothschild organized substantial British war loans, including a major issue in 1854 that raised £16 million for the war effort. James handled parallel French borrowing requirements. The mechanics were familiar, the scale enormous, and the profits real. Whatever private reservations the family held, their public role was clear. When governments at war needed money, the Rothschilds provided it. What they refused to do was lend to Russia. This refusal was partly principled and partly calculated. Russia's treatment of Jewish communities within its borders had long made the family deeply reluctant to strengthen the Tsar's hand. But calculation reinforced principle. Lending to both sides of an active conflict carried reputational and practical risks that the family had no reason to accept. Russia was isolated, its credit questionable, and the political cost of financing the Tsar would have been severe in both London and Paris. The refusal held firm throughout the war. Russia lost. The Peace of Paris in 1856 redrew the map of European influence, weakening Russian prestige and temporarily elevating France to a position of continental authority. The Rothschilds had financed the winning coalition and emerged from the war in a strong position. Yet something had shifted beneath the surface. The war had accelerated a transformation in European finance that would define the coming decades. The scale of modern industrial warfare required capital on a scale that strained even Rothschild resources. Joint stock banks, pooling the savings of thousands of investors rather than relying on family wealth and private networks, had grown significantly during the 1840s and 50s. They were hungry for exactly the kind of large-scale government business that had built Rothschild dominance. The Credit Mobilier in France, backed by the Pereire brothers, had become a direct and aggressive competitor, with ambitions that stretched well beyond what any previous rival had attempted. The Crimean War had revealed something the family would spend the next generation grappling with. Their power to prevent wars was a myth. Their power to profit from wars was real but no longer exclusive. The world of European finance was growing larger, more complex, and more competitive with every passing year. The real challenge to Rothschild dominance was not arriving on any battlefield. It was forming in boardrooms across Paris and London, built by men who had studied the family's methods and were determined to surpass them. Otto von Bismarck did not believe in the gentle persuasions of financial diplomacy. He believed in blood and iron, and between 1864 and 1871, he proved his point 3 times over. The wars of German unification came in rapid succession. First Denmark in 1864, then Austria in 1866, then France in 1870. Each conflict reshaped the European map. Each one forced the Rothschilds to make choices that grew progressively more painful. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 struck closest to home. Vienna and Frankfurt, 2 of the family's 5 great houses, found themselves on opposite sides of a shooting war. The Austrian house under Anselm von Rothschild had deep ties to the Habsburg government. The Frankfurt house, the family's ancestral home, sat directly in the theater of conflict. When Prussian forces crushed Austria at the Battle of Königgrätz in July of that year, winning in a mere 7 weeks what military planners had feared would be a long campaign, the financial damage to both houses was severe. Austrian bonds collapsed. The Frankfurt house, already weakened by decades of competition and internal strain, never truly recovered. Bismarck, for all his contempt for financiers, understood their utility perfectly. His personal banker was a man named Gerson von Bleichroeder, a Berlin financier who had begun his career as a Rothschild agent and maintained close ties with the family throughout his life. Bleichroeder became indispensable to Bismarck, managing the Chancellor's personal fortune and channeling the financial requirements of Prussian statecraft. He was, in a sense, the Rothschild model transplanted into the new Prussian order. Discreet, well-connected, essential. But his loyalties ran to Berlin now, not to the old family network centered on Frankfurt and Vienna. The Franco-Prussian War of 1871 completed the transformation. Napoleon III, the nephew whose rise James de Rothschild had quietly facilitated a generation earlier, led France into a catastrophic defeat. Prussian forces besieged Paris. Napoleon surrendered at Sedan in September of 1870. The Second Empire collapsed, replaced by a Third Republic born in humiliation. The terms Bismarck imposed on defeated France were staggering. 5 billion francs in war reparations, the largest indemnity in European history to that point. Here the Rothschilds found, paradoxically, one of their greatest practical opportunities within their most troubling political moment. The French government turned to the Paris house to help organize the transfer of this enormous sum. Alphonse de Rothschild, who now led the Paris operations, coordinated a financial operation of remarkable complexity, helping raise and transfer funds on a scale that impressed even hostile observers. France paid the indemnity in full by 1873, 2 years ahead of schedule. But the political world the family had navigated for half a century was gone. In 1801, Mayer Amschel Rothschild had established the Frankfurt House, the origin point of everything that followed. 70 years later, in the aftermath of German unification, Frankfurt was absorbed into the new German Empire. The house that bore the family's name in their home city closed its doors in 1801. It finally ceased operations in 1801. The Frankfurt House formally closed in 1871. The counting house where it had all begun on the Judengasse, the Street of Jews, was gone. The symbol was impossible to ignore. The old Europe of competing states and careful balances, the Europe the Rothschilds had learned to navigate with such extraordinary skill, had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Nationalism had rewritten the rules. The question now was whether the family could survive the rewriting. By 1875, the Rothschild name still carried enormous weight. But weight, as any banker knows, must be demonstrated to be believed. In November of that year, on a quiet autumn evening in London, Lionel de Rothschild would provide the most spectacular demonstration the family had ever staged. The setting was the Suez Canal. Opened just 6 years earlier in 1869, the canal had transformed global commerce almost overnight. The 100-mile waterway cutting through Egyptian sand linked the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, slashing the voyage from Britain to India by thousands of miles. For the British Empire, whose lifeblood ran through trade with the subcontinent, this narrow channel was not merely convenient. It was essential. Whoever controlled the Suez Canal held a hand on the jugular of British imperial power. The canal had been built by a French-led consortium, and France held the dominant shareholding position. Britain, which had opposed the project during construction, now found itself uncomfortably dependent on a waterway it did not control. This was the strategic context when, in the autumn of 1875, a remarkable opportunity suddenly appeared. Khedive Ismail of Egypt had spent years borrowing extravagantly to modernize his country, financing railways, buildings, and military ventures on credit he could not sustain. By 1875, Egypt was sliding toward bankruptcy. The Khedive held roughly 44% of the canal shares, some 177,000 shares in total. He needed cash, desperately and immediately. He began quietly sounding out buyers. Word reached Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, through diplomatic channels. Disraeli grasped the significance instantly. This was not merely a financial transaction. This was a chance to anchor British influence at the most strategically critical point on Earth. But there was a problem. Parliament was not in session. The British government had no mechanism to raise £4 million on short notice, and the opportunity would evaporate within days. The French were already circling. On a Tuesday evening in November, Disraeli sent his private secretary, Montagu Corey, to New Court, the Rothschild Bank in the City of London, to call on Lionel de Rothschild. The question Corey carried was breathtaking in its directness. Could the bank provide £4 million by tomorrow morning on behalf of the British government, with parliamentary approval to follow? Lionel de Rothschild reportedly paused, ate a grape from the bunch on his desk, and asked a single question. "What is your security?" The answer came back, the British government. His reply was equally brief. "I'll take it." By the following morning, the funds were arranged. The British government purchased the Khedive's shares outright. Disraeli wrote to Queen Victoria with undisguised triumph, informing her that the government had acquired a controlling stake in the canal company. "It is," he told her, "yours, madam." The commission the Rothschilds earned was reported at £100,000, a handsome sum for a single evening's work. But the money was almost secondary. What the transaction announced to the world was something larger. Here was a private banking house that could mobilize £4 million overnight, without parliamentary machinery, without delay, on nothing more than a government's word and 3 generations of carefully accumulated trust. The purchase was also, in retrospect, one of the last great acts of the classic Rothschild era. Lionel himself would die in 1879, just 4 years later. The world he had mastered so completely was already shifting beneath the family's feet. The canal shares secured Britain's imperial lifeline for decades. But new forces were gathering that no amount of financial genius could easily manage. The age of high nationalism was deepening, and with it came pressures the Rothschilds had never confronted in quite this form before. The Suez transaction was a masterpiece of the old order. But even as Lionel de Rothschild ate his grape and sealed the deal, a different kind of banking was already reshaping the landscape around him. The change had begun building since the 1850s when a pair of French financiers, the brothers Émile and Isaac Pereire, launched an audacious experiment called Crédit Mobilier. The concept was elegant and disruptive in equal measure. Rather than relying on the accumulated wealth of a single family, Crédit Mobilier raised capital from thousands of ordinary shareholders, pooling their modest savings into a financial force that could rival the great private houses. Within a decade, similar institutions were spreading across Europe. In 1870, Germany's Deutsche Bank opened its doors in Berlin, built specifically to finance the country's exploding industrial ambitions and its growing overseas trade. These new corporate banks possessed a structural advantage that no family fortune could simply match. They could grow indefinitely by issuing more shares, absorbing more investors, and channeling capital at a scale that made even Rothschild resources look finite. Where the family had once commanded the field almost alone, it now competed in an increasingly crowded arena. The Rothschilds were not blind to this shift. They were, however, resistant to it. The family's entire identity rested on control, discretion, and the particular trust that came from dealing with named individuals rather than faceless committees. To open their books to public shareholders felt like a violation of everything that had made them powerful. So they held their course as a private partnership, accepting the limitation that came with that choice. That resistance carried real costs. Credit Mobilier collapsed dramatically in 1867, vindicating some of the Rothschilds' skepticism about the model. But the corporate form itself survived the wreckage and continued spreading. The family found themselves increasingly confined to certain niches rather than commanding the entire field. The most significant shift, though, was not happening in Paris or Berlin. It was happening across the Atlantic. By the 1880s, the United States was becoming the largest economy on Earth, and its financial needs were enormous. A new generation of American bankers, led by the formidable John Pierpont Morgan, was stepping into that space with ruthless confidence. Morgan did not need Rothschild intermediaries to access American capital markets. He built his own transatlantic networks, his own client relationships, his own reputation for unshakable reliability. Financial gravity was drifting westward, toward a continent the Rothschilds had never fully dominated. The family's response was characteristically pragmatic. If the sovereign bond business was becoming more competitive, they would find new terrain. Through the final decades of the 19th century, the Rothschilds moved aggressively into mining, oil, and commodities, backing ventures in South African gold, Burmese rubies, and the nascent Caspian oil fields through their investments alongside the emerging Royal Dutch Shell enterprise. The family was adapting as it always had. But adaptation, by its nature, is an acknowledgement that the old world has passed. By the 1870s, the Rothschilds had drawn a clear conclusion from the competitive pressures closing in around them. Sovereign bonds and government finance were no longer enough. The family turned its attention to the earth itself, to the minerals and commodities buried beneath 3 continents, and began building an industrial empire to rival anything they had constructed in the counting houses of London and Paris. Their entry into mining was calculated and sweeping. In 1873, the family took a controlling stake in the Rio Tinto mines of southern Spain, ancient copper workings that dated back to Roman times. Under Rothschild management, Rio Tinto was transformed into one of the largest copper producers in the world, supplying the raw material for the telegraph cables and electrical wiring that were remaking modern civilization. The family also secured dominance over the Almaden mercury mines, giving them near total control over a metal essential to everything from thermometers to gold refining processes. Whoever controlled mercury in large part controlled how gold moved through the global economy. And gold itself was the next frontier. When the Witwatersrand discoveries of 1886 revealed that South Africa sat atop the largest gold deposits ever found, the Rothschilds moved quickly. Through their partnership with the mining house of Jules Porgys and their close relationship with Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Bitt, the family became deeply embedded in the South African mining complex. They helped finance the infrastructure, the machinery, and the corporate structures that would eventually coalesce into the great mining giants of the 20th century. De Beers diamonds and Rand gold flowed through financial channels the Rothschilds helped construct. Yet not everything the family built in these decades smelled of sulfur and engine grease. In 1853, Nathaniel de Rothschild had purchased Chateau Mouton, a Bordeaux estate whose wines would eventually carry the family name into dining rooms around the world. Then, in 1868, James de Rothschild's heirs acquired Chateau Lafite, already considered one of the greatest vineyards on earth. These were not merely vanity purchases. They were statements of permanence, of rootedness in the French soil at a moment when the family's political standing needed cultivating as carefully as any vine. The oil business offered a different kind of opportunity. The Rothschilds invested heavily in the Baku oil fields along the Caspian Sea, becoming major players in Russian petroleum at precisely the moment when the Rockefellers in America and the Nobels in Russia were racing to dominate global energy. The competition was fierce and the stakes were enormous. Taken together, this portfolio of mines, vineyards, and oil fields represented something new, a deliberate strategy to spread risk across geography and industry. European politics could destabilize any single market, but copper from Spain, gold from South Africa, wine from Bordeaux, and oil from the Caspian could not all collapse at once. The family had learned, over a century of uncertainty, never to keep everything in one place. For all the treaties financed and governments sustained, the Rothschilds never forgot what they were. They were Jews. And in 19th century Europe, that fact carried consequences no amount of wealth could entirely dissolve. The struggle was most visibly embodied in one man. In 1847, Lionel de Rothschild won election to the British Parliament representing the City of London. He won again in 1850, and again after that. Yet for 11 years, he could not take his seat. Parliamentary procedure required a Christian oath, and Lionel refused to swear one. Session after session, he appeared at the bar of the House of Commons, sat briefly, and withdrew. The spectacle made him a symbol of something larger than himself, a test of whether Britain's celebrated liberalism was genuine or merely decorative. Finally, in 1858, Parliament yielded. The oath was reformed. Lionel took his seat, hat on his head, swearing on the Hebrew Bible. It had taken over a decade, but the door had opened. What followed was not only political. Across Europe, Rothschild money quietly built the infrastructure of Jewish communal life. Schools in Frankfurt and London, hospitals in Paris, agricultural training programs in the Pale of Settlement where millions of Jews lived under Russian imperial restriction. These were not acts of public performance. They were sustained, structural investments in communities the family understood to be vulnerable in ways that balance sheets could not fully protect. Then came Palestine. Beginning in the 1880s, a young Edmund de Rothschild, son of James, began channeling funds into small agricultural settlements along the Mediterranean coast. He financed the founding of Rishon LeZion, Zichron Yaakov, and dozens of other villages, sending agronomists, teachers, and administrators alongside the money. By 1914, Edmund had spent an estimated 40 million francs on what he called simply the settlements. He asked for little recognition. He wanted results. Yet the formal Zionist movement, crystallized by Theodor Herzl's political organizing in the 1890s, made the family uncomfortable. Herzl sought the Rothschilds out directly, seeing their wealth and prestige as essential to his cause. He was rebuffed, politely but clearly. The family worried that a public Jewish homeland campaign would inflame the very anti-Semitism it sought to escape, and might jeopardize the careful civic standing they had spent generations constructing across Europe. That ambivalence held until history overrode it. On the 2nd of November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour addressed a letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, head of the British branch of the family. It declared His Majesty's government favorably disposed toward the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. One letter, one name, and a century of cautious navigation suddenly gave way to something irreversible. The question that had shadowed the family for generations had finally found a document. What it would mean in practice, the next century would spend a very long time answering. By 1890, the Rothschild name still commanded extraordinary reverence in European financial circles. But reverence is not the same as necessity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world had begun building ways to do without them. The first sign was structural. The Naples House, established in the early decades of the century as the family's foothold in southern Europe, quietly closed its doors in 1863. What had once been a network of 5 coordinated banking houses stretching from London to Vienna now functioned as 4, and the symmetry that had given the family its almost supernatural reach began to contract. The brothers who had fanned out from Frankfurt with matching instructions and a shared cipher were long dead. Their grandchildren were English gentlemen, French aristocrats, Austrian barons. Cousins who corresponded politely, but no longer moved as one organism. Meanwhile, governments had drawn a lesson from their own dependence. Central banks, strengthened and systematized across Europe, gave nation-states tools they had lacked at the century's opening. The Bank of England, the Banque de France, the German Reichsbank established in 1876. These institutions could mobilize capital on a scale that reduced, though never entirely eliminated, the need for private intermediaries. A government that could issue its own debt through its own institutions no longer needed to wire a coded message to New Burlington Street and wait for a reply. The family felt this shift, though they adapted with characteristic composure, moving into new investments, mining ventures in South Africa, railroad financing in the Americas. Wealth remained. What diminished was indispensability. Then came the Dreyfus Affair, and with it, a different kind of reckoning. When Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish French army officer, was falsely convicted of treason in 1894, the eruption of antisemitism that followed shocked even those who had long understood its presence beneath the surface of European civilization. The Rothschilds watched France, the country where James had built his greatest monument, convulse with hatred. They understood the message underneath the spectacle. Wealth had not bought safety. It had merely bought delay. The generational shift compounded everything. The founders had been builders animated by hunger and necessity. Their inheritors were custodians, capable and often brilliant, but operating in a world that no longer offered the same stark opportunities. Natty Rothschild, the first Lord Rothschild, managed the London house with skill through the end of the century, but even he could not redirect the gravitational pull of history. And that history was accelerating towards something terrible. The alliance systems binding Europe into rival blocs, the naval arms race between Britain and Germany, the nationalism spreading through every chancellery and barracks on the continent. These were forces no banker, however powerful, could price or negotiate. The Rothschilds had financed wars. They had not been able to prevent them. And the war that was coming would be unlike anything any balance sheet had ever contemplated. When the shots rang out in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914, the financial world held its breath. In the weeks that followed, as the alliance system snapped into fatal sequence, bankers across Europe scrambled to do what bankers had always done in moments of crisis. They reached for the telephone. They sent urgent telegrams. They arranged meetings. It was not enough. It had never been going to be enough. The Rothschilds had spent a century operating on a fundamental belief that war was bad for business, that the threat of financial disruption could cool the hottest political passions. And for a century, that belief had been largely justified. But 1914 was different. The men making decisions in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg were not primarily thinking about bond markets. They were thinking about honor, about strategic necessity, about what their generals had been telling them for years. Finance could not reach them. What followed placed the family in a position of almost unbearable paradox. The London house supported British war financing. The Vienna house, loyal to the Habsburg Empire it had served for generations, did the same for Austria-Hungary. Rothschild money, in some form, flowed toward both sides of the same catastrophic conflict. The very interconnection that had made them indispensable in peace made them a kind of tragic symbol in war. The destruction came quickly and comprehensively. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, one of the family's oldest and most important relationships, simply ceased to exist by 1918. The Vienna House, which had financed Habsburg ambitions for nearly 100 years, suddenly found its entire institutional world dissolved. The emperors and ministers who had once summoned the Rothschilds to discuss the financing of armies were gone. The empire itself was gone, replaced by a collection of struggling successor states with neither the creditworthiness nor the grandeur of what came before. In the East, the losses were equally devastating, if more sudden. The Russian Revolution of 1917 wiped out enormous investment positions in a matter of months. Decades of careful lending, railway financing, and industrial investment in the Russian Empire vanished when the Bolsheviks repudiated imperial debts and nationalized foreign holdings. There was no negotiation. There was no compensation. There was only the abrupt closure of a ledger. The family survived the war. Survival had always been one of their core competencies. But the world that emerged from 1918 was not one they had built or fully understood. The old empires were gone. The old certainties were gone. The intimate relationships between private bankers and sovereign governments, relationships built over lifetimes of trust and carefully managed mutual dependence, now existed in a landscape transformed beyond recognition. They would continue, adapting as they always had. But the era in which a family of bankers could genuinely shape the fate of nations had quietly, irrevocably closed. What, then, do we make of them? 2 centuries after Mayer Amschel Rothschild sent his sons across Europe with instructions to build something permanent, the name they carry remains one of the most recognized in the world. That recognition, however, tells us almost nothing useful about who they actually were or what they actually did. Somewhere between documented history and popular imagination, the Rothschilds became something other than a family of bankers. They became a symbol, and symbols are notoriously indifferent to the truth. The genuine achievements deserve stating plainly. The Rothschilds pioneered the international bond market, creating mechanisms for moving capital across borders that had never existed before. They demonstrated that private finance could stabilize governments, fund infrastructure, and yes, sometimes prevent wars by making conflict too expensive to contemplate. The railway networks they financed transformed how people moved through Europe. Their innovations in credit, in information networks, in risk management shaped institutions that persist to this day. By any honest measure, they were among the most consequential financiers in modern history. Then came the distortion. Through the 19th century and into the 20th, anti-Semitic propagandists seized upon the family's visibility and wealth to construct an entirely different story. This version posited secret control, hidden manipulation, a shadowy hand directing the fate of nations for private gain. The fabrications spread through pamphlets, newspapers, and eventually the machinery of Nazi propaganda, which used the Rothschild name as a weapon. The family's genuine power was real enough. The invented version was something else entirely, a conspiracy fantasy that served political purposes having nothing to do with banking or history. That fantasy carried a devastating cost. When the Nazis swept across Europe after 1933, the Rothschilds became targets not just of propaganda but of organized theft and terror. Assets were seized, properties confiscated, family members forced to flee. Louis von Rothschild of the Vienna House was arrested in 1938 and held for more than a year before being released in exchange for surrendering virtually everything the Austrian branch had built across a century. Some family members did not escape. The gap between the imagined all-powerful controllers of the conspiracy myth and the actual human beings stripped of their possessions and freedom could not have been more stark. They rebuilt, as they always had. The modern Rothschild businesses operate in investment banking and asset management across multiple continents. Their philanthropic foundations support arts institutions, scientific research, and conservation efforts in ways that rarely attract the attention of conspiracy theorists but represent a quiet, genuine commitment to the societies they inhabit. What the full story reveals, finally, is something worth remembering. Wealth and influence, however formidable, have never been the same as omnipotence. The Rothschilds bent history in places, shaped it at moments, and were crushed by it more than once. They were, in the end, human beings navigating a world that neither they nor anyone else fully controlled. That is a more complicated story than the myth. It is also, by any measure, a far more interesting one. The Rothschilds did not rule the world, but they helped finance the one we inherited. Subscribe for more histories that cut through the myth to find the truth beneath.